Welcome to the deep dive. You've given us this collection of pamphlets here from the Family Research Institute.
That's right.
And what you're looking for, it seems, is a clearer picture of the arguments they're making about homosexuality and, the evidence they actually present.
Exactly. The goal is really to understand their arguments, their data, without getting totally swamped by it all.
So our mission today is basically to unpack these claims, get to the heart of their perspective, based purely on what's in these materials.
Precisely. We want to navigate what they're saying, the data they use, just guide you through what the Family Research Institute is emphasizing here.
And wow, these pamphlets cover a lot of ground. We're going to be looking at their views on what causes homosexual desire, their claims about child molestation and homosexuality, the medical consequences they talk about, violence, the whole born that way debate.
Right, the psychology too, and same-sex marriage, it's extensive.
It really is. And it's all coming from, well, a very particular viewpoint.
Absolutely, and that's key. As we go through this, our focus is just on understanding that viewpoint as it's laid out right here in these sources.
Okay, let's dive in then. First up, how these pamphlets talk about the origins of homosexual desire. They kick things off mentioning a survey saying most people find homosexual activity, quote, puzzling or repugnant. Only a small minority saw any possibility of enjoyment.
Yeah.
That really frames it from the start, doesn't it?
It really does. Starting there, highlighting this supposed lack of understanding or appeal from the, average person.
Yeah.
It subtly challenges the normalcy of it right away.
And then they go straight for the born that way idea. They question if these proclivities, as they call them, are natural or something else. They lay out three sort of traditional views on where it comes from. A bad habit, basically, from sexual permissiveness, a mental illness, like arrested development.
The old psychoanalytic view. Yeah.
And then, of course, the biological angle, genetics, hormones.
Right. Those three create a kind of backdrop. The first two lean on older, often quite negative ideas. The biological one, though, that's the one they seem really focused on countering throughout.
And counter it they do. They argue pretty strongly that homosexual behavior is learned. And they offer, 7 lines of evidence?
7 points, yes.
First, they say there's a lack of solid biological or genetic differences, unless those differences are caused by the behavior itself.
Right. They suggest studies hinting at a genetic link are, usually discounted or not replicable.
So the main takeaway there, according to them, is no inherent biological cause. That phrase, not caused by their behavior, is doing a lot of work there.
It is. It implies any biological differences found might be a result, not a root cause.
Okay, second point. They point back to older studies, Kinsey in the 40s, another one in 1970, where homosexual individuals themselves apparently believe their feelings came mostly from social or environmental stuff.
Right, but then they contrast that with their own 1983 FRI study,
where more homosexuals thought it was hereditary.
But almost all heterosexuals in that same study thought their preferences were learned. It's an interesting contrast they draw.
Yeah, it kind of suggests that maybe the born that way idea gained traction more recently, possibly linked to, activism.
That seems to be the implication. And the fact that heterosexuals mostly pointed to learning reinforces the FRI's view that environment shapes sexuality.
Their third point is pretty blunt. The idea that older homosexuals often initiate younger people into homosexual activity.
They cite studies.
Yeah, claiming like 60-something% said their first partner was older and initiated things. They mention UK and US studies about adults approaching kids.
And a London study with significant age gaps for boys' first experiences.
And this is a very serious claim. They assert a quarter of homosexuals admitted to sex with children or underage teens.
It's a deeply concerning assertion in the pamphlet, linking homosexual behavior directly to the exploitation of minors. It presents a very negative picture.
Definitely. And building right on that, their fourth argument. Early homosexual experiences, especially the first one, are strong predictors of adult behavior.
Right. They reference Kinsey data analysis, that 1970 Kinsey Institute study, and their own 83 study again.
Emphasizing that link between the first encounter and later orientation.
It really supports their learned behavior model. If that first experience is framed as so pivotal, it backs the idea that orientation develops. It's not just expressed.
Fifth point brings in culture, religion specifically. Kinsey found less homosexual activity among devout groups, and their 83 study found people from non-religious homes were 4 times more likely to be homosexual.
So the suggestion is that norms, religious beliefs, can act as a kind of deterrent, again supporting the idea of choice influenced by surroundings.
They also mention higher rates among Black men, possibly linked to fatherless homes, another environmental factor in their view.
Right, presented as social, not genetic.
Okay, sixth piece of evidence,
Yeah.
many people change their sexual preferences.
They cite a study.
Where lots of self-identified lesbians and homosexuals also reported attraction, relationships, even love for the opposite sex, and a national study where very few men only ever had sex with men.
Highlighting fluidity. The fact that many who identify as homosexual have also had heterosexual feelings or relationships is used to argue against orientation being fixed, immutable.
And finally, the seventh point, the existence of ex-homosexuals. People, they say, change their desires and behavior, maybe through therapy or religion.
Yeah, they draw a parallel to overcoming addictions, like a cure.
And mention a study where almost 2% of heterosexuals said they once considered themselves homosexual. This idea of change is really central.
Absolutely. This concept is key to their argument against born that way. It suggests homosexual desires aren't fixed and can be managed or eliminated.
So after laying out those 7 points, they talk about factors they think cause strong homosexual desires. Things like, well, the homosexual experience itself, family issues, dominant mother, absent father, that kind of thing.
Unusual childhood sexual experiences, cultural influences, like a visible subculture, pro-homosexual sex ed.
Right. They're building this picture of how these different factors might lead someone down that path, so to speak.
Essentially, proposing it arises from a mix of learned behaviors, environment, maybe influential or negative early experiences.
And they wrap up that section saying homosexuality can be changed, like controlling other sexual desires. They advise avoiding practicing homosexuals and suggest things like ex-gay ministries, therapy, religion.
The core message: it's not inherent, it can be overcome with effort and the right support, according to them.
Okay, now shifting to a very sensitive area. Child molestation and its connection, according to these pamphlets, to homosexuality.
This is a difficult section.
They start by acknowledging the common view, mentioning Ann Landers and the APA, saying homosexuals are less likely to abuse kids.
Right. They set up that widely held view immediately, signaling they intend to challenge it with their evidence.
They then ask, well, why is sex between boys and men reported so often? And they question which type of molestation, homosexual or heterosexual, is proportionally more common given the population sizes.
That focus on proportion is key. They're asking about relative risk.
Yeah.
Even if absolute numbers are lower, is the rate higher compared to the smaller homosexual population? That's the core question they pose.
And they present what they call 3 types of scientific evidence. Surveys of molestation in the general population.
Okay.
Surveys of convicted molesters.
Right.
And reports from homosexual individuals themselves. And their claim is this evidence shows that the 1-3% of adults practicing homosexuality account for a much bigger slice of child molestation, like a fifth to a third.
It's really important here to look closely at the specific studies they cite and how they're interpreting that data, because it's the foundation for this link they're drawing.
They summarize findings from U.S. and UK general population surveys from the 80s, and based on the genders reported, they conclude a significant chunk of molestation involves homosexual acts.
The interpretation there hinges heavily on assuming same-sex molestation automatically means a homosexual perpetrator. Worth considering if that's always the case, or if other factors might be involved.
They also cite a 1985 literature review, which they say concluded homosexual acts were involved in, 25 to 40% of recorded cases?
Again, the definition of homosexual acts matters. Does it mean the perpetrator identified as gay, or just the gender combination in the act itself? The pamphlet seems to equate the two.
Then they look at surveys of convicted offenders, Toronto, Philly, Massachusetts, England, showing they report varied but significant percentages of offenders identified as homosexual. They even drop in a quote from 1947 England linking male homosexuality to the corruption of youth.
Surveys of inmates give some data, but it's a specific group, not necessarily representative of everyone. The historical quote shows these concerns aren't new, though.
And then admissions from homosexuals themselves, Kinsey 48, a 70 Kinsey interview in San Francisco, the Gay Report, about relations with minors.
And a French study they mentioned?
Right, about convicted gay men having a high average number of boy victims.
Self-reports have value, but also potential biases. That French study especially, you'd need to look very closely at the methodology and who exactly they studied.
So they conclude this part by saying, across reports, convictions, and surveys of gay individuals, about a third of cases involved homosexuality. A consistent finding, they claim.
That's the central assertion. Based on their reading of the data, homosexual involvement in molestation is disproportionately high.
Then they pivot to teacher-student sexual interaction. Highlighting worries about homosexual teachers, they summarize various studies suggesting homosexual teachers are disproportionately involved in sexual contact with students.
Another very sensitive area, trying to establish a direct link between identity and abuse in a position of authority.
And from that, they conclude homosexual teachers are more likely to be sexually involved with kids.
A conclusion based on their interpretation of the reference studies. Again, the methodologies and potential biases within those studies are crucial.
The pamphlet then really hammers the point. Even if only 1–3% of adults are homosexual, they account for 20–40% of molestations. So they argue the risk is 10–20 times greater from homosexuals.
That's the core of their proportional risk argument, using their presented data to frame homosexuality as a significant risk factor.
Finally, this section looks at the goals of the gay movement, citing a 1987 article about ending oppression towards pedophilia, a Dutch group linking pedophilia and gay liberation, and Ambile's presence in parades.
This draws a direct and highly controversial link between the broader gay rights movement and pedophilia, suggesting an agenda to normalize adult-child sex.
They wrap it up saying the gay rights movement wants to legitimize child-adult homosexual sex, and there's a strong, disproportionate link between molestation and homosexuality, contradicting claims otherwise.
A very strong, potentially inflammatory conclusion. It's vital to remember this is the specific viewpoint in these pamphlets and might not align with broader research or understanding.
Okay, moving on. The medical consequences of what homosexuals do, according to these pamphlets, they start with history, civilizations, religions condemning it, illegality.
Right, setting that historical backdrop of disapproval.
Then they mention the counter-argument. Gays facing hostility for harmless acts, and the APHA telling the Supreme Court oral anal sex don't inherently cause problems.
Setting up the conflict. The view of these acts as benign versus the health risks the pamphlet is about to detail.
They summarize surveys on homosexual behavior, noting global similarities, maybe temporary changes. They include that table listing activities, oral anal, urine sex, fisting, fecal stuff, torture, public sex, sex with minors.
With percentages from various studies.
Intended to show how common specific practices are, laying the groundwork for the health risks discussion.
Exactly, providing a basis for associating specific behaviors with health risks.
Then they get detailed. Risks of oral sex, STDs, lesions, dangers of rectal sex fluid feces mixing, Hep B, HIV, syphilis spread, anal tearing, fisting risks, potential colostomy.
They link fisting reports as increasing since Kinsey's time, too.
Fecal sex linking oral anal contact and ingesting feces to Hep A, gay bowel syndrome, citing SF public health data on parasites, a scarlet fever outbreak, CDC data on Hep A.
Emphasizing direct health risks, they tie to specific homosexual practices using medical info and stats.
They also cover urine sex, golden showers, citing survey percentages, and briefly touch on S&M, sex with minors, again, public sex, drug use.
Broadening the scope beyond just intercourse, portraying a lifestyle they link with various risky activities.
They acknowledge AIDS fear might have reduced partners for some, but say the number's still high, citing Morin and McCusick, then wider consequences. High STD rates, 70–78%, intestinal parasites, 25–59%, and the stat that by 92–83% of U.S. white AIDS cases were in gay men. Recapping a Seattle Diary study on ACT frequency.
Highlighting the significant health burden they attribute to homosexual behavior, especially infectious diseases.
Then lifespan. Claiming homosexuals have shorter lives, like smokers or addicts, comparing obituaries from gay papers to regular ones.
Showing much lower median death ages for homosexuals. 49 for AIDS, 42 non-AIDS, versus 75–50 and 79 for married heterosexuals.
And higher rates of violent death, murder, suicide, accidents. A very stark claim about longevity.
Yes, a very serious claim, directly linking the behavior to reduced lifespan and increased violent death risk. The obituary comparison is striking.
They talk about the gay legacy of AIDS, potential risks to healthcare workers, quoting Dr. Max Essex on new microbes.
Extending the concern beyond the individual to wider public health implications.
They use the term biological swap meet to describe the sexual practices, frequent fluid exchange, many partners, unsanitary conditions, travel spreading diseases globally.
That's a very strong metaphor, underscoring their view of the activity as inherently risky and a major factor in disease spread.
And the pattern of infection, how diseases can jump from the gay community to the general population. Tropical diseases in NYC, HIV worldwide, scarlet fever.
Reinforcing the idea that the health fallout isn't contained, posing a risk to the wider population.
They conclude with a call for genuine compassion, which means discouraging, not legitimizing, a destructive lifestyle due to health risks affecting everyone.
The final message there is that societal disapproval is necessary for public health and safety, in their view.
Right. Okay, let's shift to violence and homosexuality. They start with anecdotes, two specific violent crimes involving lesbians and a young man and his father's partner.
Starting with dramatic examples, immediately tries to forge that association in the reader's mind. Homosexuality equals violence.
They contrast the old psychiatric view, linking violence to social problems, with gay leaders saying they're gentle victims of gay bashers, needing hate crime laws.
Setting up that dichotomy, challenging the portrayal of homosexuals only as victims, suggesting they might also be perpetrators.
They examine different violence types, noting the small percentage of adults who are homosexual or bisexual, setting the stage for disproportionality of arguments.
Using that demographic baseline to suggest that if homosexuals are overrepresented in violence stats, it might indicate a greater tendency towards violence.
Then, murder and mass murder. Citing Chikatilo Dahmer, listing top U.S. male serial killers, all identified as gay. Lesbian serial killers, too. Historical figures. Citing a study of sexually tinged mass murders where they say 68% of victims were killed by those practicing homosexuality and 44% of the murderers were bisexual. A direct, disturbing link.
The focus on serial killers is particularly graphic, a tactic to link homosexuality with extreme violence.
Well,
Stats aim for a quantitative connection.
Then violent sexual practices, saying a substantial minority engage in painful violent sex, BDSM, S&M, citing an old psychiatrist, a national survey showing higher rates among homosexuals. Examples from gay publications promoting violent sex, a London case appealing an S&M conviction.
Focusing on specific behaviors they label as violent, using anecdotes and survey data to suggest prevalence.
Then, deliberately infecting others, noting the clash between activists arguing for private consent and the risks for multiple partners, high STD rates.
Right.
They claim some intentionally spread STDs. Citing history, a study showing more homosexuals admitting to this, discussing patient zero, costs of deliberate AIDS transmission, linking violent sex practices to willingness to infect.
A very alarming claim, suggesting malicious intent among some and connecting it to violent sex practices.
They also look at homosexual rape, citing the National Crime Survey on male victims, data from some cities, suggesting an increase with the gay rights movement, more common in urban gay areas, citing studies showing high reported rates among gays lesbians, highlighting statutory rape involving homosexuality, discussing how rape might influence orientation.
Exploring assault within the community, and also suggesting same-sex assault could contribute to developing a homosexual orientation.
Then, violence impacting lifespan again, citing that obituary study showing higher violent death rates, murder, suicide, accidents contributing to lower median death age.
Connecting the claimed increased violence risk within the community to shorten lifespans.
They conclude that the hate crimes gays complain about are, quote, infrequent and often just verbal, contrasting FBI data with activist claims. Stating violence goes hand in hand with the gay lifestyle, most exposure happens within the subculture, which might even export more violence than it absorbs.
The final message. Violence experienced by homosexuals is largely generated internally, not primarily from external homophobic attacks, according to this view.
Okay, now the Born What Way pamphlet kicks off challenging the idea that gays are born that way can't change, citing Masters Johnson case as a counterexample.
Right, immediately framing it as nature versus nurture and clearly taking the nurture side.
Raising questions about biological determinism, possibility of change. They highlight the political stakes, citing a 93 poll showing views on gays in the military shifted based on belief in choice versus immutability. Acceptance levels, too.
Underscoring the real-world impact, how beliefs about origins shape attitudes and policy.
Contrasting views from psychiatrists. Freud overcoming his urges, Richard Isay declaring his natural and joining the subculture.
Providing that historical professional context for differing psychiatric views.
They mention Isay admitting traditional psychoanalysis thought homosexuality could and should be changed, but Isay called attempts to change it abuse, argued for societal acceptance instead.
Right. And they note Isay believed it was biological, relying on LaVey's gay brains and Bailey and Pillard's gay twins studies from '91.
Key studies they then aim to dismantle.
Exactly. Those are the main scientific pillars supporting a biological component that this pamphlet targets.
They bring up a '93 critical review by Bein and Parsons in a major psychiatry journal. Conclusion. No current evidence supports a biological theory of sexual orientation.
Presenting this review as strong scientific counter-evidence refuting biological determinism.
Explaining how Bynum Parsons dismissed the gay brain's study flawed analogy between rat and human brain parts, technical issues with LeVay's sample, AIDS patients' unknown orientations.
And inconsistencies even within LeVay's own data.
Right, some heterosexuals had smaller relevant brain areas than some gays, and vice versa. The critique focuses on methodology, interpretation, trying to undermine its credibility.
Essentially saying the science was shaky, the comparisons weren't valid, the sample was compromised, serious doubts about the findings, according to FRI.
Then the gay twins study, noting Bailey and Pillard's 52% concordance for identical twins, but also King and McDonald's later study finding only 25%.
And emphasizing Bynum Parsons pointing out the discordant twins in both studies, identical twins who didn't share orientation.
Underscoring unknown, non-genetic factors must be involved. If it were purely genetic, concordance in identical twins should be 100% theoretically. The gap shows genes aren't the whole story.
Exactly, suggesting factors beyond genetics play a big role.
So the pamphlet's conclusion on the biology, evidence is tenuous, unreliably replicated, flawed.
That's their bottom line on the biological argument lacks solid support.
Then they present evidence suggesting homosexuality is adopted by confused, adventurous, rebellious people, implying flexibility, choice. Citing that 1970 Kinsey Institute study again, 81% of gays, 93% of lesbians reported shifts in feelings behavior after age 12, many starting after 18.
Suggesting orientation can evolve, challenging the fixed-at-birth idea.
Other findings from that study: high percentages reporting opposite-sex arousal, heterosexual marriages, even sex with animals presented as inconsistent with pure biology.
Presented as evidence against a rigid biological model, suggesting fluidity and choice.
Then their own 83 FRI survey results, supporting choice, they say. High percentages reporting opposite sex, love, arousal, sex, heterosexual marriage, arguing these are choices inconsistent with biological inevitability.
Using their own survey to reinforce that experiences usually linked with heterosexuality are common among homosexuals, implying choice or flexibility.
Also citing FRI findings on people who were once homosexually inclined but now heterosexual, almost a third with adult homosexual relations now heterosexual. Plus a Dallas survey, wives in swinging becoming bisexual.
More examples of shifts away from homosexual identity behavior key to arguing it's not fixed.
Then, consequences of tolerance, suggesting it might lead more youth to try it. Citing Dr. Hewitt's analysis showing more homosexuality in accepting societies. Quoting that 92 advocate editorial in Patients with Born Gay, suggesting teaching gay is okay, even if numbers increase, there are more of us than there used to be.
Introducing the societal implications. Does acceptance increase prevalence?
Pointing out older studies, Kinsey 40s, 1970, showed only about 9% claimed to be born that way versus 35% in their 83 survey after it became politicized.
Suggesting belief in biology might be influenced by social political factors, not just science.
Concluding, no hard evidence for biological basis for unusual sexual desires. Participation is will plus opportunity. Society rightly expects behavioral control.
Rejecting biological determinism, emphasizing personal responsibility for behavior.
Okay, psychology next. Starts by framing things around societal contribution. Those avoiding responsibilities, work, family, historically viewed negatively. Labeling rakes and homosexuals as selfish, separating sex from procreation.
Framing homosexuality within a socioeconomic context, suggesting it deviates from traditional norms of productivity and family.
Arguing historically, homosexuals seen as non-productive, dangerous to youth, rebelling against natural order. Contrasting with heroic tales valuing productivity, unselfishness.
Portraying homosexuality historically as harmful to community well-being.
Claiming as norms change, old warnings are coming true. Homosexuals recruiting, forming communities, undermining traditional values, concern about acceptance.
Expressing concern that increased acceptance leads to negative social outcomes, challenges established norms.
Presenting traditional social psychiatric theory. Productive people are happy, non-productive are dissatisfied, seek distraction, rebels have adjustment problems, envy productive people, summarizing traditionalist psychiatrists, Bergler, Bieber, Socarides, linking homosexuality to negative traits like malice, narcissism, anger, low responsibility, obsession.
Outlining that older psychological view, linking homosexuality to maladjustment, personality issues, unhealthy coping.
Contrasting with modern egalitarianism. Equal worth regardless of productivity. No link between productivity and well-being. Homosexuals, psychiatrically, socially, same as heterosexuals. Believing acceptance brings well-being.
Presenting the opposing contemporary view. Normalize homosexuality. Attribute distress to discrimination.
Posing the psychological question, are homosexuals troubled due to discrimination or their own psychology from choice experiences?
Directly addressing that central debate.
The pamphlet argues personality problems are inherent to the homosexual life. Discrimination against the inclinations is necessary for the greater good and the individual, preventing pathologies.
Arguing for an internal, not external, cause of psychological challenges.
Describing reverse socialization of homosexuality, kids taught to avoid feces, but homosexual activity involves it. Detailing a progression involving anal anal contact, arguing it reverses childhood hygiene training.
A particularly graphic argument linking the behavior to reversing fundamental training, portraying it as unnatural, potentially damaging psychologically.
Citing Remethetti studies on gay youth, 87-91. Suggesting early homosexual-bisexual identity increases dysfunction, suicide risk. Later self-labeling correlates with fewer problems.
Using these studies to argue that identifying as homosexual, especially early, links to negative psychological outcomes.
Discussing social disruption. Summarizing 5 studies comparing homosexual heterosexuals. Finding more instability, lovers, jobs, psychiatric issues, marital problems, criminality, less social cohesion among homosexuals. Highlighting the largest study, 4,340 adults, 5 cities, linking homosexuality to poorer health, more crime, weaker human bonds, less marriage, kids, fidelity.
Presenting data interpreted as evidence of social personal dysfunction associated with homosexuality.
Emphasizing importance of social cohesion, citing a national survey showing homosexuals have less connection to opposite sex, different generations, more peer-oriented, fewer intergenerational relatives as intimates. Arguing this hinders social harmony.
Arguing their social networks are less diverse intergenerational, negatively impacting social cohesion.
Asking if societal acceptance helps, using San Francisco. Noting after decriminalization acceptance, Kinsey surveys showed increase in anal activity, suggesting increased risk. Also, more partners but more reported loneliness, suicide attempts thoughts in 70 versus 40s. A 91 SF study showing younger generations behaving more dangerously.
Arguing acceptance doesn't necessarily improve well-being, may even correlate with more risk, worse outcomes.
Concluding, limited evidence suggests where acceptance occurred, problems increase, leading to more misery, isolation. Discussing impermanency of the lifestyle, declining sexual interest after 30, health issues, short lifespan, loss of connections, contrasting with permanence of marriage, parenthood.
Right.
Noting half of gays express regret, 4 times as many would advise teens against it. Ending by calling the gay life short, lonely, negative, with traits like those in death camps, suggesting happiness comes from productivity, not sexual freedom.
A very strong, highly negative portrayal of the psychological and social consequences, arguing against it as a path to well-being.
Finally, same-sex marriage. Starting with society's interest in prohibiting behavior endangering health safety, leading to historical bans on homosexual liaisons.
Framing the issue in terms of societal protection from perceived dangers.
Noting demands for legal recognition, adoption rights. Arguing scientific evidence suggests legalization would harm society and homosexuals.
Framing opposition is based on preventing negative consequences for everyone involved.
Claiming traditional marriage improves health, low domestic violence, prolongs life, best for kids. Contrasting with homosexual coupling, undermines health, high domestic violence, shortens life, poor for kids.
A stark contrast, outlining perceived superior outcomes for traditional marriage.
Fact #1, homosexual marriages are short-lived. Arguing the push is for legitimacy, not commitment, as most aren't monogamous, prefer living alone. Citing studies 60s-90s showing low cohabitation monogamy, short relationship lengths. Discussing Denmark post-legalization, low marriage rates, high divorce death rate.
Challenging the idea that homosexuals want or can form stable long-term marriages. Using stats on cohabitation, monogamy, duration. The Danish example suggests legal status doesn't change patterns.
Fact #2. Studies show homosexual marriage is hazardous to health, claiming committed homosexuals engage in riskier, unsanitary sex than singles, increasing disease risks. Citing studies, 80s-90s, showing gay men in relationships more likely to have unprotected anal sex, other risky behaviors. A lesbian study linking monogamy to unprotected sex, sign of trust. Concluding both gays lesbians more apt to take biological risks with partners. Gays disproportionately get diseases from partners versus strangers.
Focusing on potential health risks within same-sex relationships, suggesting relationship dynamics might facilitate disease transmission.
Fact #3. Homosexual marriage has highest domestic violence rate. framing DV as public health issues, claiming empirical evidence suggests higher rates in homosexual couples, especially lesbians, citing studies, late 80s to early 90s, reporting high DV rates in gay-lesbian relationships, suggesting higher than heterosexual rates.
Challenging perceptions of same-sex relationships as less prone to violence, presenting data suggesting higher incidence.
Fact, #4. Homosexual domestic violence is a bigger problem than gay bashing. Contrasting activists focus on external attacks with argument that internal DV is more frequent, lethal.
Right.
Discussing a 95 study by DV Consortium in 6 cities, tabulating anti-gay harassment versus same-sex DV reports, reporting more calls for same-sex DV than harassment in several cities and overall.
Shifting focus from external threats to violence within the community, suggesting it may be a more significant source of harm.
Fact, #5. Homosexuals make poor parents. Stating few unbiased studies exist, mentioning the largest and only random sample study, which reportedly suggested negative outcomes for kids of homosexual parents, more likely to be molested, become homosexual, doubt sexuality, embarrassed, teased.
Raising concerns about child well-being in same-sex households, citing limited research supporting claims of risks and negative outcomes.
Concluding, same-sex marriage is a bad idea, harms everyone, especially homosexuals, increases HIV/STD risk, DV, early death. Unions not built on lifetime commitment, not good for kids. Warning against tampering with traditional marriage based on misguided compassion, like for single-parent rights, which they say harmed kids.
The final message.
Yep.
A strong condemnation, arguing it would have detrimental consequences for individuals, the community, and society.
So just to wrap up, these pamphlets from the Family Research Institute, they really paint a very specific, consistent picture. They argue homosexuality is learned, changeable, linked to social environmental factors. They strongly assert links to child molestation, citing numerous studies, detail significant negative medical outcomes, health risks, shorter lifespan, argue for an inherent link to violence, both as perpetrators and within relationships.
Right.
They strongly refute born that way, critiquing biology studies, presenting data for fluidity and choice, psychologically portrayed as linked to maladjustment, social disruption, and vehemently argue against same-sex marriage, unstable, unhealthy, violent, bad for kids.
And it's absolutely crucial to remember these are the specific arguments and interpretations presented right here in these particular pamphlets from this specific organization, the Family Research Institute.
Yeah.
They represent a distinct perspective. They draw on specific data, specific studies, often with interpretations that are, well, definitely subject to ongoing debate and discussion in the wider scientific and social arenas.
Definitely. So, considering everything we've unpacked from these pamphlets, all the arguments, the data as they present it, what really stands out to you now as the most significant points they raised? And maybe what questions are still lingering, or what areas might you want to explore from, completely different perspectives? It's clear these pamphlets offer a very particular lens, and hopefully this deep dive has given you a solid grasp of that perspective as presented right here in these sources.